Hey everyone, it's Nikki, and this past semester at college, I took a class that was centered on sex, love, and marriage in the Middle Ages, and one of the texts we read was the Lays of Marie de France, which were basically a series of kind of short stories in poetry format, all about various subjects, mostly having to do with love and romance. And for my final project for this class, I wrote an essay on the Lay Bisclavret, which centers on a man who turns into a werewolf 3 days a week and the revelation of that secret to his wife. So I thought it would be fun if I made kind of like a literal video essay of me just reading this essay that I worked on for class, since I really enjoyed it and I really enjoyed the Lay of Bisclavret, and I hope you guys do too. So enjoy! In much of the scholarship surrounding the Lay Bisclavret by Marie de France, little attention is paid to the homoerotic subtext between the titular Bisclavret and the unnamed king who takes him in while in wolf form. While the behavior between the men might seem simply emblematic of different norms of appropriate homosocial acts in medieval France and Britain, the sheer volume of hugging and kissing between the pair at the story's climax seems to go beyond platonic intimacy. Thus, I want to examine the homoeroticism between the werewolf and the king by analyzing how Bisclavret is and is not a monster, and the role monstrosity plays in cultural narratives, as well as how Bisclavret embodies and falls short of the archetypal courtly knight, the pinnacle of medieval masculinity. In order to support a queer reading of Bisclavret, I compare it to a similar lay, Melion, by an anonymous Picard author, which is significantly less homoerotic and was likely written to be an improved version of Bisclavret. Taking all of these things into account, I argue as a result of his lycanthropy, Bisclavret is able to circumvent the heterosexual norms codified by chivalric masculinity and navigate his sexuality into a nebulous, queer zone. The werewolf in Bisclavret is a multifaceted creature, at once a ferocious beast and intelligent man, and his dual nature is an affront to medieval cultural institutions of hierarchy and binary. According to Emma Campbell, human superiority over animals was generally considered a matter of hierarchy rather than essence in the Middle Ages. Despite this, with his humility, affection for the king, and desire for justice, this lay allows the reading of Bisclavret as more civilized than his human counterparts. Jeffrey J. Cohen argues that one of the essential components of a monster is its ability to overthrow cultural categories. The monster resists any classification built on hierarchy or a merely binary opposition, demanding instead a system allowing polyphony, mixed response, differences in sameness, repulsion and attraction, and resistance to interrogation. Despite the hierarchical relationship between humans and animals, writers of the 12th century when Bisclavret was written increasingly use animals as human exemplars or metaphors for human behavior, a phenomenon commonly considered to trouble an already unstable distinction between human and animal. In addition to calling into question the superiority of humans over animals, Bisclavret also disrupts the acclaim of the institution of marriage and muddies the distinction between heterosexuality and homoeroticism. And as Cohen writes, deviant sexuality is susceptible to monsterization. Bisclavret's weakly lycanthropic transformations complicate his relationship with the heteronormative institution of marriage and masculinity. Bisclavret's lycanthropic sojourns put a strain on his marriage, making his wife so anxious on the days when he leaves her. But Bisclavret doesn't reject the institution of marriage outright. When his wife questions him about his whereabouts during his weekly 3 days of absence, Bisclavret tells her, "Trouble will come to me if I tell you, for I will divide you from my love and destroy myself in doing so." It is his love for her that forces him to hide his werewolf identity instead of foregoing marriage altogether. Bisclavret's unwillingness to choose between his marriage and his werewolf lifestyle reflects the archetypal position of the monster in fiction. Monsters are disturbing hybrids who externally incoherent bodies resist attempts to include them in any systemic structuration. Bisclavret defies the hierarchical order of humans and animals, in effect also defying the strict tenets of chivalric masculinity. As Cohen notes, animality is supposed to be a despised state, the abject condition against which humanity asserts itself. The werewolf knows better. This monster inhabits a space of undifferentiated concurrency. We can see that despite Bisclavret saying in the beginning that there would never again be hope for him if he were to remain a werewolf eternally, he seems to not totally despise his lycanthropy. When the royal court torture Bisclavret's wife and subsequently retrieve his clothing, enabling him to turn back into a human, the king offers the clothes to the wolf, but Bisclavret does not take notice at all. According to Cohen, this is because Bisclavret learns the equivalence between two forms that seemed mutually exclusive of human and wolf, learns their indifference. Instead of foregoing courtly masculinity completely or strictly aligning himself with every component of it, he creates a hybrid masculinity that is deeply unsettling to the order of medieval society in the intimate relationships between men and women within the tale. In the Lays of Marie de France, courtly and chivalric masculinity are inherently tied to heterosexuality. However, Bisclavret manages to be masculine while avoiding ending up in a monogamous heterosexual marriage. Bisclavret is introduced as a paragon of chivalric masculinity. In Brittany there lived a worthy man whom I have heard marvelously praised. He was a handsome, good knight, and conducted himself nobly. And in a society where the ideals of the successful knight and the successful lover of a lady were increasingly conflated, Bisclavret's relationship with his wife at first seems to fulfill those ideals, as he loved her and she him. However, once Bisclavret reveals his secret to his wife, she does not want to lie beside him anymore, removing the heterosexual component from his masculinity. Yet despite the loss of sexual activity between Bisclavret and his wife, he still retains much of his courtly masculinity. Even as a wolf, he retains the loyalty and sense of justice he arguably possessed as a human. His wife's rejection does not emasculate him, but instead presents his static masculinity, a concrete picture of what it means to be male and a knight, so solid that it remains constant even in physical transformations out of and into humanity. Moreover, the tale's happy ending does not include a reunification between Bisclavret and his wife, or marriage to a new, hopefully more faithful woman, but instead leaves Bisclavret in the service of the king in a purely homosocial environment, seemingly free of any women, even a queen. While Bisclavret does not end with a knight with a willingness to accept a female lover, the lay does end with a knight who is loyal in love. It's just that loyalty is devoted to a man, the king. Due to his relationship with the king, Bisclavret subverts the outline of chivalric masculinity outlined by Schneider. Bisclavret's relationship to his king, which Marie evidently considers part of his good character, goes beyond the bounds of purely platonic or humble. Bisclavret's first interaction with the king in the lay occurs after his wife has betrayed him and he is stuck roaming the woods as a wolf. Upon encountering the king on a hunt, he runs up to him and kisses his leg and his foot, which the king interprets as both a sign of humility and humanity. However, the subsequent behavior of Bisclavret and the king goes beyond the relationship of a merely humble servant and benefactor. On the way back to the castle, Bisclavret stays very close to the king. It does not wish to leave, it does not care to part from him, illustrating an affection for the king as well as gratefulness. Bisclavret always follows the king wherever he had to go, for he did not care to be apart from him, and desires to be close to the king even when the two of them are sleeping, going to bed among the knights and close to the king every day. Cohen interprets Bisclavret's actions as a manifestation of his indifference towards distinctions between animality and humanity, stating, "He is at once like a favorite hunting dog and like a good household knight." However, I believe that there is more to Bisclavret's attention lavished on the king, namely that it signifies feelings of a romantic or at least deeply intimate loving bond, as in response to Bisclavret's behavior, Marie writes that the king could see well that Bisclavret loved him. There's also the matter of Bisclavret's relationship with his king predating the events of the story. While some of Bisclavret's actions in wolf form seem to be his trying to hint to the king that he is not a regular wolf, he seems more concerned with being close to him than turning himself back into a human. For example, Bisclavret doesn't try to lead the king to his former wife, but instead the king leads the investigation after Bisclavret attacks her husband. Bisclavret's affection for the king leads him to forego getting his own vengeance. Moreover, the king also has affection for the werewolf. After the king, his knights, and Bisclavret returned to the castle, Marie writes, "He considered the wolf a great wonder, and held it very dear. He commanded all his people to take good care of it for love of him." After Bisclavret attacks his wife's new husband, the king, in a wise and courteous act, takes it upon himself to investigate the matter by going to the forest where the wolf had been found. After the wife reveals where she and her new husband hid Bisclavret's clothes and brings them back to the king takes care of Bisclavret alone. The king himself led the wolf into his bedroom and closed all the doors on him. While the king's actions were under the advisement of the wise man's diction indicates he was suggesting that the king have one of his servants take care of Bisclavret for him. The king's doing it himself suggests a higher level of affection than even the wise man seemed to be cognizant of. But the most intimate scene in the lay occurs when the king checks on Bisclavret with two of his men. On the king's own bed, he found the knight sleeping. The king ran to embrace him. More than 100 times he hugs and kisses him. While the presence of the two men with the king dampens the romance, suggesting that this interaction may have been construed as platonic, even considering the good relationship Bisclavret had with the king before his disappearance and the affection the two shared while he was in wolf form, does not fully account for the excessively intimate imagery of kissing someone lying on one's own bed more than 100 times. And why does Bisclavret lie on the king's own bed instead of merely near it, as he had done in wolf form? Could he have been hoping for a more private moment with the king after his transformation? And then there's the aftermath of this scene, where the king returns Bisclavret's lands to him and Marie writes, "He gave him more than I can say." While in context this line seems to refer to lands and material riches, its phrasing also bears similarities to the ways in which medieval writers often describe love and other emotions as incapable of being articulated with words. It also gives Bisclavret and the king some privacy they had previously not been afforded by the two members of the king's men, suggesting a potential intimate relationship between the two. As June H. McCash notes, the good king at the end of Bisclavret welcomes his restored knight back to his court, thus showing him the fidelity that his wife lacked. The king essentially replaces Bisclavret's wife, and unlike her, he is able to accommodate and even love Bisclavret as both a man and a wolf, making Bisclavret's hybrid masculinity not only possible, but preferable to a life cohabiting with treacherous women. The depiction of heterosexuality in the intimate relationship between Bisclavret and his king can be further understood by contrasting it with the relationships between the werewolf, his wife, and the two kings in the lay Melion. For instance, Melion presents a different type of masculinity than the chivalric one outlined by Schneider, instead exemplifying violence as a masculine trait. According to McCash, Melion is an example of what Donald Maddox has called a critically motivated rewriting, or, to use the medieval term, an immollatio or modification of one of Marie de France's lays, in this case Bisclavret. As an immollatio, we can examine the differences between Melion and Bisclavret as things that the author of Melion saw as lacking. For instance, Melion's masculinity as a wolf is much more savage than Bisclavret's, with Melion marauding around Ireland with a pack of real wolves, and Melion comes far closer to fulfilling Marie's stereotypical description of a savage werewolf, which the Picard author no doubt knew, than does Bisclavret. And while the wife of Bisclavret receives a more physically denigrating punishment than the wife of Melion, the presentation of Bisclavret's attack nonetheless anticipates its designation as human rather than animal behavior. Marie prefaces the denasalizing bite with an encouragement to see it in terms of human vengeance. Bisclavret and Melion also have different family circumstances to contend with. Bisclavret has no children with his wife, so dooming her offspring to lives of noselessness has no impact on him. Melion, on the other hand, has 2 sons with his wife, who are clearly children the author considers more valuable than Bisclavret's wife's daughters, particularly to a knight with little promise of a future marriage back in Arthur's realm, where he has still not cleared up his little problem with the ladies. Speaking of wives and family, there is a greater emphasis on heterosexuality in Melion than in Bisclavret. Melion is allegedly very courtly and noble, and he made himself beloved of all. However, all doesn't extend to the female population of Arthur's kingdom, as they vow that they will never marry him due to his exacting demands on their chastity. Because of that rejection, it's not surprising that when Melion does find a woman who meets his demands, he marries her and devotes himself to her. The impetus behind Melion's lycanthropy is due to his trying to please his wife, whereas Bisclavret attempts to hide his lycanthropy in order to maintain his relationship with his wife. Bisclavret's lycanthropy is at odds with his heterosexuality, while Melion's arises because of it. And finally, there is the bifurcation of the role of the good king in Bisclavret into King Arthur and King Eater of Ireland. In Melion, King Eater does not happen upon the werewolf on a hunt like the good king of Bisclavret, but instead he sets out in a deliberate attempt to kill him and the 10 other wolves in his pack. Once King Arthur arrives in Dublin in Deus Ex Machina fashion, Melion throws himself at the king's feet and remains with him during a dinner party. The king in Bisclavret notes that the werewolf has human understanding. In contrast, King Arthur describes Melion as tame, not ascribing any humanity to the wolf. Unlike Bisclavret and the Good King, there is no romantic or even affectionate subtext between Melion and King Arthur, and the latter seems merely bemused by the marvel that is a wolf who eats bread. While both tales end with the lycanthropic knights reunited with their kings, the relationship between Melion and Arthur is downplayed by comparison to the ending of Bisclavret. After all, Melion has heirs and is thus still involved in the heteropatriarchal family system, while Bisclavret, with no offspring, is free from its confines to live as both a human and a wolf with his king. The fate of Bisclavret is left ambiguous at the end. While we learn that his king has banished his wife and returned his lands to him, whether he intends to remain with the king or live as a bachelor and possibly remarry and have children in the future is left up in the air. Moreover, we don't know what has become of Bisclavret's lycanthropy. Did his transformation back into a human after living as a wolf for a year cure him of it, or does he still have to turn into a wolf 3 days a week? These ambiguities complicate the reading of Bisclavret, as we as readers cannot know whether Bisclavret returned to the heterosexual world or remained in his queer domain with the king. Knowing what Bisclavret does after the events of the story might also give a clearer picture on how we might construe Bisclavret's sexuality in modern terms. Is he gay and hiding it from his wife, or is he bisexual but rejected by his wife due to his perceived sexual deviancy? Regardless, due to the nature of the werewolf as an archetype representing both duality and secret shame, I believe that Bisclavret is a useful story for the analysis of queer narratives from the Middle Ages. Alright, that was my final essay for this class. I hope you enjoyed my thoughts on the Lay Bisclavret, and I think that it's a really interesting lay that everyone should read. And I think the Lays of Marie de France more broadly were a very interesting text to read, so I highly encourage you guys go check it out. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!